Chapter 1. The Principle of Animals' Rights. Have the lower animals rights? Undoubtedly, if men have. That is the point I wish to make evident in this opening chapter. But have men rights? Let it be stated at the outset that I have no intention of discussing the abstract theory of natural rights, which at the present time is looked upon with suspicion and disfavour by many social reformers, since it has not unfrequently been made to cover the most extravagant and contradictory assertions. But though its phraseology is confessedly vague and perilous, there is nevertheless a solid truth underlying it, a truth which has always been clearly apprehended by the moral faculty, however difficult it may be to establish it on an unassailable logical basis. If men have not rights, well, they have an unmistakably imitation of something very similar, a sense of justice which marks the boundary line where acquiescence ceases and resistance begins, a demand for freedom to live their own life, subject to the necessity of respecting the equal freedom of other people. Such is the doctrine of rights as formulated by Herbert Spencer. Every man, he says, is free to do that which he wills, provided he infringes not the equal liberty of any other man. And again, whoever admits that man must have a certain restricted freedom asserts that it is right he should have this restricted freedom, and hence the several particular freedoms deducible may fitly be called, as they commonly are called, his rights. The fitness of this nomenclature is disputed, but the existence of some real principle of the kind can hardly be called in question, so that the controversy concerning rights is little else than an academic battle over words, which leads to no practical conclusion. I shall assume, therefore, that men are possessed of rights, in the sense of Herbert Spencer's definition, and if any of my readers object to this qualified use of the term, I can only say that I shall be perfectly willing to change the word as soon as a more appropriate one is forthcoming. The immediate question that claims our attention is this: if men have rights, have animals their rights also? From the earliest times there have been thinkers who, directly or indirectly, answered this question with an affirmative. The Buddhist and Pythagorean canons, dominated perhaps by the creed of reincarnation, included the maxim not to kill or injure any innocent animal. The humanitarian philosophers of the Roman Empire, among whose Seneca and Plutarch and Porphyry were the most conspicuous, took still higher ground in preaching humanity on the broadest principle of universal benevolence. Since justice is due to rational beings, wrote Porphyry, how is it possible to evade the admission that we are bound also to act justly towards the races below us? It is a lamentable fact that during the churchdom of Middle Ages, from the 4th century to the 16th, from the time of Porphyry to the time of Montaigne, little or no attention was paid to the question of the rights and wrongs of lower races. Then, with the reformation of the revival of learning, came a revival also of the humanitarian feeling, as may be seen in many passages of Erasmus and More, Shakespeare and Bacon. But it was not until the 18th century, the age of enlightenment and sensibility, of which Voltaire and Rousseau were the spokesmen, that the rights of animals obtained more deliberate recognition. From the Great Revolution of 1789 dates the period when the worldwide spirit of humanitarianism, which had hitherto been felt by but one man in a million, the thesis of the philosopher or the vision of the poet, began to disclose itself, gradually and dimly at first, as an essential feature of democracy. A great and far-reaching effect was produced in England at this time by the publication of such revolutionary works as Paine's Rights of Man, Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Women, and looking back now after the lapse of 100 years, we can see that the still wider extension of the theory of rights was henceforth inevitable. In fact, such a claim was anticipated, if only in bitter jest, by a contemporary writer who furnishes us with a notable instance of how the mockery of one generation may become the reality of the next. There was published anonymously in 1792 a little volume entitled A Vindication of the Rights of Brutes, a reductio absurdum of Mary Wollstonecraft's essay, written, as the author informs us, to evidence by demonstrative arguments the perfect equality of what is called the irrational species to the human. The further opinion is expressed that after those wonderful productions of Mr. Paine and Mrs. Wollstonecraft, such a theory as the present seems to be necessary. It was necessary, and a very short term of years sufficed to bring it into effect. Indeed, the theory had already been put forward by several English pioneers of 19th century humanitarianism. To Jeremy Bentham, in particular, belongs the high honour of first asserting the rights of animals with authority and persistence. The legislator, he wrote, ought to interdict everything which may serve to lead to cruelty. The barbarous spectacles of gladiators no doubt contributed to give the Romans that ferocity which they displayed in their civil wars. A people accustomed to despise human life in their games could not be expected to respect it amid the fury of their passions. It is proper for the same reason to forbid every kind of cruelty towards animals, whether by way of amusement or to gratify gluttony. Cockfights, bull baiting, hunting hares and foxes, and other amusements of the same kind necessarily suppose either the absence of reflection or a fund of inhumanity, since they produce the most acute sufferings to sensible beings and the most painful and lingering death of which we can form any idea. Why should the law refuse its protection to any sensitive being? The time will come when humanity will extend its mantle over everything which breathes. We have begun by attending to the condition of the slaves. We shall finish by softening that of all animals which assist our labours or supply our wants. So too wrote one of Bentham's contemporaries. The grand source of the unmerited and superfluous misery of beasts exists in a defect in the constitution of all communities. No human government, I believe, has ever recognised the just animalium, which ought surely to form a part of the jurisprudence of every system founded on the principles of justice and humanity. A large number of later moralists have followed on the same lines, with the result that the rights of animals have already, to a certain limited extent, been established both in private usage and by legal enactment. It is interesting to note the exact commencement of this new principle in law. When Lord Erskine, speaking to the House of Lords in 1811, advocated the cause of justice to the lower animals, he was greeted with loud cries of insult and derision. But 11 years later, the efforts of the despised humanitarians, and especially of Richard Martin of Galway, were rewarded by their first success. The passing of the ill-treatment of cattle bill, commonly known as Martin's Act, in June 1822, is a memorable date in the history of humane legislation, less on account of the positive protection afforded by it, for it applied only to cattle and beasts of burden, than for the invaluable precedent which it was created. From 1822 onward, the principle of that just animalium for which Bentham had pleaded was recognised, however partially and tentatively at first, by English law, and the animals included in the Act ceased to be mere property of their owners. Moreover, the Act has been several times supplemented and extended during the past half-century. It is scarcely possible, in the face of this legislation, to maintain that rights are a privilege with which none but human beings can be invested, for if some animals are already included within the pale of protection, why should not more and more be so included in the future? For the present, however, what is most urgently needed is some comprehensive and intelligible principle which shall indicate in a more consistent manner the true lines of man's moral relation towards the lower animals. And here, it must be admitted, our position is still far from satisfactory, for though certain very important concessions have been made, as we have seen, to the demand for the jus animalium, they have been made for the most part in a grudging, unwilling spirit, and rather in the interests of property than of principle, while even the leading advocates of animal rights seem to have shrunk from basing their claim on the only argument which can ultimately be held to be really a sufficient one, the assertion that animals as well as men, though of course to be far less extent than men, are possessed of a distinctive individuality, and therefore are in justice entitled to live their lives with a due measure of that restricted freedom to which Herbert Spencer alludes. It is of little use to claim rights of animals in a vague general way, if with the same breath we explicitly show our determination to subordinate those rights to anything and everything that can be construed into a human want. Nor will it ever be possible to obtain full justice for the lower races so long as we continue to regard them as beings of a wholly different order, and to ignore the significance of their numberless points of kinship with mankind. For example, it has been said by a well-known writer on the subject of humanity to animals that the life of a brute having no more purpose can be understood ethically as representing the sum of its pleasures, and the obligation therefore of producing the pleasures of sentient creatures must be reduced, in their case, to the abstinence from unnecessary destruction of life. Now, with respect to this statement, I must say that the notion of life of an animal having no moral purpose belongs to a class of ideas which cannot possibly be accepted by the advanced humanitarian thought of the present day. It is a purely arbitrary assumption, at variance with our best instincts, at variance with our best science, and absolutely fatal, if the subject to be clearly thought out, to any full realisation of animals' rights. If we are ever going to do justice to the lower races, we must get rid of the antiquated notion of the great gulf fixed between them and mankind, and must recognise the common bond of humanity that unites all living beings in one universal brotherhood. As far as any excuses can be alleged, in explanation of the insensibility or inhumanity of the Western nations in their treatment of animals, these excuses may be mostly traced back to one or other of two theoretical contentions, wholly different in origin, yet alike in this, that both postulate an absolute difference of nature between men and the lower kinds. The first is the so-called religious notion, which awards immortality to man, but to man alone, thereby furnishing, especially in Catholic countries, a quibbling justification for acts of cruelty to animals, on the plea that they have no souls. It should seem, and says a modern writer, as if the primitive Christians, by laying so much stress upon a future life, in contradistinction to this life, and placing the lower creatures out of the pale of hope, placed them at the same time out of the pale of sympathy, and thus laid the foundation for this utter disregard of animals in the light of our fellow creatures. I am aware that a quite contrary argument has, in a few isolated instances, been founded on the belief that animals have no souls. Humphrey Primmett, for example, says that cruelty to a brute is an injury irreparable, because there is no future life to be a compensation for present afflictions, and that there is an amusing story told by Lecky in his History of European Morals of a certain humanely minded cardinal who used to allow himself to be bitten without hindrance on the ground that we shall have heaven to reward us for our sufferings, but these poor creatures have nothing but the enjoyment of this present life. But this is a rare view of the question which need not, I think, be taken into very serious account, for, on the whole, the denial of immortality to animals, unless of course it be also denied to men, tends strongly to lessen their chance of being justly and considerately treated. Among the many humane movements of the present age, none is more significant than the growing inclination, noticeable both in scientific circles and in religious, to believe that mankind and the lower animals have the same destiny before them, whether that destiny be for immortality or for annihilation. The second, and not less fruitful source of modern inhumanity, is to be found in the Cartesian doctrine, the theory of Descartes and his followers, that the lower animals are devoid of consciousness and feeling, a theory which carried the religious notion a step further and deprived the animals not only of their claim to a life hereafter, but of anything that could, without mockery, be called a life in the present, since mere animated machines, as they were thus affirmed to be, could in no real sense be said to live at all. Well might Voltaire turn his humane ridicule against the most monstrous contention, and suggest that with scathing irony that God had given animals the organs of feeling, to the end that they may not feel. The theory of animal automatism, says one of the leading scientists of the present day, which is usually attributed to Descartes, can never be accepted by common sense, yet it is to be feared that it has done much in its time to harden scientific sense against the just complaints of the victims of human arrogance and oppression. Let me here quote a most impressive passage from Schopenhauer, Let me quote a most impressive passage from Schopenhauer, the most unpardonable forgetfulness in which the lower animals have hitherto been left by the moralists of Europe. It is pretended that the beasts have no rights. They persuade themselves that our conduct in regard to them has nothing to do with morals, or, to speak the language of the morality, that we have no duties towards animals. A doctrine revolting, gross and barbarous, peculiar to the West and having its root in Judaism. In philosophy, however, it is made to rest upon a hypothesis, admitted in despite of evidence itself, of an absolute difference between man and beast. It is Descartes who has proclaimed it in the clearest and most decisive manner, and in fact it was a necessary consequence of his errors. The Cartesian, Leibnizian, Wolferian philosophy, with the assistance of entirely abstract notions, had built up in the rational psychology and constructed an immortal anima rationalis. But visibly the word of beasts, with its very natural claims, stood up against this exclusive monopoly, this brevet of immortality decreed to man alone, and silently nature did what she always does in such cases. She protested. Our philosophers, feeling their scientific conscience quite disturbed, were forced to attempt to consolidate her, their rational psychology, by the aid of empiricism. They therefore set themselves to work to hollow out between man and beast an enormous abyss of an immeasurable width. By this they to prove to us, in contempt of evidence, an impassable difference. The fallacious idea that the lives of animals have no moral purpose is at the root connected with these religious and philosophical pretensions that Schopenhauer so powerfully condemns. To live one's own life, to realise one's true self, is the highest moral purpose of man and animal alike, and that animals possess their due measure of this sense of individuality is scarcely open to doubt. We have seen, says Darwin, that the senses and intuitions, the various emotions and faculties, such as love, memory, attention, curiosity, imitation, reason, etc., of which man boasts, may be found in an incipient, or even sometimes in a well-developed condition, in the lower animals. Not less emphatic is the testimony of the Reverend J.G. Wood, who, speaking from a great experience, gives it as his opinion that the manner in which we ignore individuality in the lower animals is simply astounding. He claims for them a future life because he is quite sure that most of the cruelties which are perpetuated on the animals are due to the habit of considering them as mere machines without susceptibilities, without reason, and without the capacity of a future. This, then, is the position of those who assert that animals, like men, are necessarily possessed of certain limited rights, which cannot be withheld from them, as they are now withheld without tyranny and injustice. They have individuality, character, reason, and to have those qualities is to have the right to exercise them, in so far as surrounding circumstances permit. Freedom of choice and act, says Atida, is the first condition of animal as of human happiness. How many animals in a million have even relative freedom in any moment of their lives? No choice is ever permitted to them, and all their most natural instincts are denied or made subject to authority. Yet no human being is justified in regarding any animal whatsoever as a meaningless automaton, to be worked or tortured or eaten, as the case may be, for the mere object of satisfying the wants or whims of mankind. Together with the destinies and duties that are laid on them and fulfilled by them, animals also have the right to be treated with gentleness and consideration, and the man who does not so treat them, however great his learning or influence may be, is in that respect an ignorant and foolish man, devoid of the highest and noblest culture of which the human mind is capable. Something must here be said on the important subject of nomenclature. It is to be feared that the ill treatment of animals is largely due, or at any rate the difficulty of amending that treatment is largely increased, by the common use of such terms as brute beast, livestock, etc., which implicitly deny to the lower races that intelligent individuality which is most undoubtedly possessed by them. It was long ago remarked by Bentham in his introduction to Principles of Morals and Legislation that whereas human beings are styled persons, other animals, on account of their interests having been neglected by the insensibility of the ancient jurists, stand degraded to the class of things, and Schopenhauer also has commented on the mischievous absurdity of whom which applies the neuter pronoun it to such highly organised primates as the dog and the ape. A word of protest is needed also against such an expression as dumb animals, which though so often cited as an immense exhortation to pity, has in reality a tendency to influence ordinary people in quite the contrary direction, inasmuch as it fosters the idea of an impassable barrier between mankind and their dependents. It is convenient to us men be deaf to the entreaties of the victims of our injustice, and by sort of grim irony we therefore assume that it is they who are afflicted by some organic incapacity. They are dumb animals, forsooth. Although a moment's consideration must prove that they have innumerable ways, often quite human in variety and suggestiveness, of uttering their thoughts and emotions. Even the term animals, as applied to the lower races, is incorrect and not wholly unobjectionable, since it ignores the fact that man is an animal, no less than they. My only excuse for using it in this volume is that there is absolutely no other brief term available. So anomalous is the attitude of the man towards the lower animals, that it is no marvel if many humane thinkers have well nigh despaired over this question. The whole subject of the brute creation, wrote Dr. Arnold, is to me one of such painful mystery that I dare not approach it, and this, to put the most charitable interpretation on their silence, appears to be the position of the majority of moralists and teachers at the present time. Yet there is an urgent need of some key to the solution of the problem, and in no other way can this key be found than by the full inclusion of the lower races within the pale of human sympathy. All the promptings of our best and surest instinct point us in this direction. It is abundantly evident, says Lecky, both from history and from present experience, that the instinctive shock or natural feelings of disgust caused by the sight of the sufferings of men is not generically different from that which is caused by the sight of the suffering of animals. If this be so, and the admission is a momentous one, can it be seriously contended that the same humanitarian tendency which has already emancipated the slave will not ultimately benefit the lower races also? Here again, the historian of European models has a significant remark. At one time, he says, the benevolent affections embrace merely the family, soon the circle expanding includes first a class, then a nation, then a coalition of nations, then all humanity, and finally its influence is felt in the dealings of man with the animal world. In each of these cases, a standard is formed, different from that of the preceding stage, but in each case, the same tendency is recognized as virtue. But it may be argued, vague sympathy with the lower animals is one thing, and a definitive recognition of their rights is another. What reason is there to suppose that we shall advance from the former phase to the latter? Just this, that every great liberating movement has proceeded exactly on these lines. Oppression and cruelty are invariably founded on a lack of imaginative sympathy. The tyrant or the tormentor can have no true sense of kinship with the victim of his injustice. When once the sense of affinity is awakened, the knell of tyranny is sounded, and the ultimate concession of rights is simply a matter of time. The present condition of the more highly organised domestic animals is in many ways very analogous to that of the slaves of 100 years ago. Look back and you will find in their case precisely the same exclusion from the common pale of humanity, the same hypocritical fallacies to justify that exclusion, and as a consequence, the same deliberate stubborn denial of their social rights. Look back, for it is well to do so, and then look forward, and the moral can hardly be mistaken. We find so great a thinker and writer as Aristotle seriously pondering whether a slave may be considered as in any sense a man. In emphasizing the point that friendship is founded on propinquity, he expresses himself as follows: neither can men have friendships with horses, cattle, or slaves, considered merely as such, for a slave is merely a living instrument, and an instrument a living slave, yet considered as a man. A slave may be an object of friendship, for certain rights seem to belong to all those capable of participating in law and engagement. A slave, then, considered as a man, may be treated justly or unjustly. Slaves, says Bentham, have been treated by the law exactly upon the same footing as in England, for example, the inferior races of animals are still. The day may come when the rest of the animal creation may acquire those rights which could never have been withholden from them but by the land of tyranny. Let us unreservedly admit the immense difficulties that stand in the way of this animal enfranchisement. Our relation towards the animals is complicated and embittered by innumerable habits handed down through centuries of mistrust and brutality. We cannot, in all cases, suddenly relax these habits or do full justice, even when we see that justice will have to be done. A perfect ethic of humaneness is therefore impracticable, if not unthinkable, and we can attempt to do more than to indicate in a general way the main principle of animals' rights, noting at the same time the most flagrant particular violations of those rights, and the lines on which the only valid reform can hereafter be effected. But on the other hand, it may be remembered for the comfort and encouragement of humanitarian workers that these obstacles are, after all, only such as are inevitable in each branch of social improvement, for at every stage of every great reformation it has been repeatedly argued by indifferent or hostile observers that further progress is impossible. Indeed, when the opponents of a great cause begin to demonstrate its impossibility, experience teaches us that the cause is already on the high road to fulfilment. As for the demand so frequently made on reformers that they should first explain the details of their scheme, how this and that point will be arranged, and by what process all kinds of difficulties, real or imagined, will be circumvented, the only rational reply is that it is absurd to expect to see the end of this question, when we are now but at its beginning. The persons who offer this futile sort of criticism are usually those who under no circumstances would be open to conviction. They purposely ask for an explanation which by the very nature of the case is impossible, because it necessarily belongs to a later period of time. It would be equally sensible to request the traveller to enumerate beforehand all the particular things he will see by the way, on pain of being denounced as an unpractical visionary, although he may not have a sufficient general knowledge of his course and destination. Our main principle is now clear. If rights exist at all, and both feeling and usage indubitably prove that they do exist, they cannot be consistently awarded to men and denied to animals, since the same sense of justice and compassion apply in both cases. Pain is pain, says an honest old writer, whether it is inflicted on man or on beast, and the creature that suffers it, whether man or beast, being sensible of the misery of it while it lasts, suffers evil, and the sufferance of evil, unmeritedly, unprovokedly, where no offence has been given, and no good can possibly be answered by it, but merely to exhibit power or gratify malice, is cruelty and injustice in him that occasions it. I commend this outspoken utterance to the attention of those ingenious moralists who quibble about the discipline of suffering and depreciate immediate attempts to redress what, it is alleged, may be a necessary instrument for the attainment of human welfare. It is perhaps a mere coincidence, but it has been observed that those who are most forward to disallow the rights of others, and to argue that suffering and subjection of the natural lot of all living things are usually themselves exempt from the operation of this beneficent law, and that the beauty of self-sacrifice is most loudly belauded by those who profit most largely at the expense of their fellow creatures. But nature is one with rapine, say some, and this utopian theory of rights is too widely extended, must come in conflict with the iron rule of internecine competition by which the universe is regulated. But is the universe so regulated? We note this very objection, which was confidently relied on a few years back by many opponents of the emancipation of the working classes, is not heard of that in connection now. Our learned economists and men of science who set themselves to play the defenders of the social status quo have seen their own weapons of natural selection, survival of the fittest, and what not, snatched from their hands and turned against them, and are therefore beginning to explain to us in a scientific manner what we untutored humanitarians had previously felt to be true, viz., that competition is not by any means the sole governing law among the human race. We are not greatly dismayed, then, to find the same old bugbear trotted out as an argument against animals' rights. Indeed, we already see unmistakable signs of a similar complete reversal of the scientific judgment. The charge of sentimentalism is frequently brought against those who plead for animals' rights. Now, sentimentalism, if any meaning at all can be attached to the word, must signify as inequality, an ill balance of sentiment, an inconsistency which leads men into attacking one abuse, while they ignore or condone another, where a reform is equally desirable. That this weakness is often observable among philanthropists on one hand and friends of animals on the other, and most among those acute men of the world, whose regard is only for themselves, I am not concerned to deny. What I wish to point out is that the only real safeguard against sentimentality is to take up a constant position towards the rights of men and of lower animals alike, and to cultivate a broad sense of universal justice, not mercy, for all living things. Herein, and herein alone, is to be sought the true sanity of temperament. It is an entire mistake to suppose that the rights of animals are in any way antagonistic to the rights of men. Let us not be betrayed for a moment into the specious fallacy that we must study human rights first, and leave the animal question to solve itself hereafter, for it is only by a wide and disinterested study of both subjects that the solution of either is possible. For he who loves all animated nature, says Porphyry, will not hate any one tribe of innocent beings, and by how much greater his love for the whole, and by so much the more will he cultivate justice towards a part of them, and that part to which he is most allied. To admit all worthier reasons, it is too late in the day to suggest that the indefinite postponement of a consideration of animals' rights, for from a moral point of view, even from a legislative point of view, we are daily confronted with this momentous problem, and the so-called practical people who affect to ignore it are simply shutting their eyes to facts which they find it disagreeable to confront. Once more then, animals have rights, and these rights consist in the restricted freedom to live a natural life, a life that is, which permits of the individual development, subject to the limitations imposed by the permanent needs and interests of the community. There is nothing quixotic or visionary in this assertion. It is perfectly compatible with a readiness to look the sternest laws of existence fully and honestly in the face. If we must kill, whether it be man or animal, let us kill and have done with it. If we must inflict pain, let us do what is inevitable, without hypocrisy or evasion or cant. But here is the cardinal point. Let us first be assured that it is necessary. Let us not wantonly trade on the needless miseries of other beings, and then attempt to lull our consciences by a series of shuffling excuses which cannot endure a moment's candid investigation. As Leigh Hunt well says, that there is no pain and evil is no rule, that I should make it greater, like a fool. Thus far of the general principle of animals' rights. We will now proceed to apply the principle to a number of particular cases, from which we may learn something both as to the extent of its present violation and the possibility of its better observance in the future.